My name is Brianna, and I was 18 when my mother, Kimberly, turned our luxury real estate agency's charity gala into a public ranking of her daughters. She took the microphone in the center of the grand ballroom, raised her champagne glass, and announced to our wealthiest clients, "At least she is smart. Beauty skipped her, but maybe intelligence will have to pay her bills." The room erupted. Not everyone laughed, but enough of them did. Then she pulled my sister Ashley beside her, smoothed the silk of her designer gown, and added, "This one got the looks. God knows how to balance a family." My father, Richard, just stared at the marble floor. Several investors lifted their phones to record the spectacle. I stood there under the glowing chandeliers, realizing my bloodline viewed me strictly as an ugly, utilitarian joke. I was not a daughter. I was a depreciating asset. Have you ever been made to feel like the invisible, spare child in a room full of people? Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled her perfect life 12 years later, drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. Tears are a poorly calculated liability. I skipped the emotional audit, knowing an apology from my mother was a sunk cost I refused to wait for. My fury bypassed screaming entirely, settling into a cold, methodical focus. I simply turned around, walked out of the grand ballroom, and went straight to the registration desk. I pulled my house key off its ring and placed it perfectly centered on a stack of charity donation forms. I took a cab to my childhood home one last time, packed a single duffel bag, and emptied the cash envelope hidden in my desk drawer. $580. Every single cent I had earned from tutoring and part-time administrative work, that was my severance package. The night train to Chicago cost $65. I bought a one-way ticket for the midnight departure. As the carriage rattled through the dark, watching the Michigan state line dissolve into the black window, I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret. But there was only clarity. This departure was not an emotional collapse, but rather the execution of a permanent personal divestment. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, constantly paying the emotional overhead while they reaped the dividends. Now, I realized their affection had been a subscription, with me footing the bill for a service I never received. I was cutting my losses and liquidating a toxic asset. My mind kept returning to my father, Richard. For 18 years, I had convinced myself he was just a helpless bystander, a quiet man trapped in the relentless hurricane of my mother's ego and my sister's vanity. But sitting on that train, listening to the rhythmic clattering of the wheels, the cold math finally made sense. His silence was not helplessness. It was a calculated transaction. He normalized her cruelty because intervening would cost him his own comfort. Enablers like my father are not victims, they are co-conspirators. They buy their peace by throwing you to the wolves. When he stared at the marble floor during that toast, he made a choice. He proved that passive silence is just as destructive as active abuse. It is a dangerous trap to believe the quiet parent is the good parent. They are simply the one outsourcing the cruelty so they can keep their hands clean. They normalize the dysfunction so they do not have to disrupt their own comfortable reality. By the time the sun came up and the Chicago skyline pierced the morning fog, the girl they humiliated was gone. My phone dropped straight into a station trash bin. Forwarding addresses and theatrical exit letters are liabilities that leave a trail. They wanted me to be invisible, so I gave them exactly what they asked for. I was no longer a daughter. I was a ghost. Years blurred into spreadsheets and silence. I did not waste time looking back. Nostalgia is a deficit, and I simply could not afford it. I took a job working the overnight shift, doing basic data entry for a massive logistics warehouse in downtown Chicago. It smelled of diesel, stale coffee, and decades of boxed shipping records, but to me, it smelled like sanctuary. No one in that basement cared if I lacked the effortless, marketable symmetry of my sister's face. They only cared that my logs were accurate, my audits were flawless, and my focus was absolute. I used that warehouse job to finance my degree, calculating every expense down to the penny. While Ashley was busy becoming a lifestyle influencer, posting meticulously curated photos of luxury vacations and designer wardrobes funded entirely by our parents, I was sleeping 4 hours a day. While she received a brand new luxury vehicle for her 20th birthday, I was working 3 shifts just to afford advanced taxation textbooks and forensic certification exams. I willingly traded the frivolity of my 20s to pour concrete over my future. I became a forensic accountant. In my line of work, deception always leaves a paper trail. A polished, beautifully formatted document can be a complete fabrication, while a stained, crumpled ledger usually holds the absolute truth. I spent my long days hunting down corporate fraud, dissecting altered contracts, tracing laundered money, and breaking down complex financial lies. I loved the cold, hard certainty of it. Every case I dismantled gave me what my childhood never had: undeniable facts that could not be overruled by the loudest, most manipulative person in the room. It was during a routine risk assessment for a commercial firm that I met Tyler. He was a structural engineer, a man who understood that a building is only as stable as the unseen foundation buried beneath the dirt. Our relationship did not start with breathless romance or grand, superficial gestures. It started with mutual respect and analytical precision. On our first date, he did not feed me empty, rehearsed compliments about my appearance. Instead, he watched me systematically dismantle a restaurant manager's attempt to double charge an elderly couple at an adjacent table. When the manager finally retreated, Tyler looked at me and called my logic structurally sound. Somehow, that meant infinitely more than being called beautiful. I told him about my family in calculated installments, offering him raw data points rather than open wounds. He never pressured me to forgive them or reconnect. He simply asked if my estrangement was yielding a positive return on investment for my mental health. The answer was an undeniable yes. Over 12 years, I had built an impenetrable fortress. I had a quiet, 6-figure career, a partnership based on absolute trust, and a life entirely independent of the toxic bloodline I had liquidated. I thought my ledger with my mother was permanently closed. I believed the transaction was over. But I was about to learn a harsh lesson about financial manipulators. They never truly close an account. They just hide the liabilities in someone else's name. 12 years after I walked out of that ballroom, the past did not return as a memory or a tearful phone call. It arrived on my desk as a highly classified risk assessment file. Our firm's automated risk management software had flagged a massive commercial default for a banking client due to a partial guarantor SSN mismatch, requiring my manual review. A holding company in Michigan was hemorrhaging cash, defaulting on a $750,000 commercial property loan. The ledger painted a pathetic picture of absolute desperation. Funds were being illegally shuffled between shell accounts to cover compounding interest. Revenue projections were vastly inflated, and the operating budget was bleeding dry. As I traced the corporate structure back to its origin to identify the liable parties, my eyes locked on the registered business address. It was the exact location of my family's luxury real estate agency, the very building where my mother had stripped away my dignity. I did not panic. I simply kept scrolling through the digitized loan application, methodically analyzing the collateral guarantees. Then, I stopped breathing. The cursor blinked over the primary guarantor authorization form. Staring back at me, printed in stark black ink, was my full legal name. Below it sat a signature that tried desperately to mimic mine, but failed entirely on the specific curve of my initials. My mother had stolen my identity. The realization was not a wave of sorrow. It was a pure, icy jolt of adrenaline. She had publicly declared me a worthless, ugly burden, yet privately found my pristine credit score to be her most valuable asset. When her superficial real estate empire began to collapse under the weight of her own vanity, she did not hesitate to leverage the daughter she had erased. She had forged my signature to secure $750,000 in commercial debt, shackling my financial future to her sinking ship. Screaming over the phone yields zero usable data. Demanding an explanation or an apology is a waste of leverage. Emotional reactions are for people who still hope for reconciliation. I was an auditor, and I had just uncovered a federal crime. Anger was not loud, it was factual. Within 10 minutes, I walked straight into my firm's compliance director's office to declare a massive conflict of interest, forcing our agency to immediately sever ties with the banking client. Once my firm legally stepped away, I was free to act as a private victim. By noon, I had compiled a meticulous dossier and submitted a comprehensive federal identity theft report. Before the end of the business day, I retained one of the most ruthless commercial fraud attorneys in Illinois. I handed him the digitized file and instructed him to prepare for immediate litigation. I was not going to play the role of the wounded, dramatic daughter seeking closure. I was a defrauded investor initiating a hostile takeover of my own narrative. This was no longer a messy family dispute over a graduation toast. My mother had unknowingly crossed the line from toxic parenting into federal wire fraud, and I was going to ensure she paid every single penalty with compounding interest. My attorney initiated a full, aggressive forensic sweep of my entire financial history. In the business of fraud investigation, when you uncover a massive commercial default, you do not just stop at the primary corporate loan. You audit the entire ecosystem. You look for the leaks. What we found buried in the secondary corporate ledgers transformed this situation from a desperate cover-up into a malicious, coordinated theft. Intertwined with the commercial debt were several high-yield business credit cards, cleverly opened under the agency's tax ID, but listing me as the liable corporate guarantor to bypass my personal credit monitoring. They had been opened 18 months ago to subsidize Ashley's lavish lifestyle, and were recently maxed out entirely to pay the final balances for her exorbitant wedding. I sat in my attorney's glass-walled conference room, meticulously tracing the line items on the statements. The transactions did not reflect a failing real estate agency trying to keep the lights on and pay their employees. They reflected pure, unfiltered vanity. There was a $15,000 charge at a premier bridal boutique. There were recurring payments to a luxury travel concierge for a first-class honeymoon package to Bora Bora. There were substantial retainers paid to elite event planners, premium florists, and custom caterers. I pulled the origination documents and cross-referenced the billing addresses, the authorized user logs, and the contact emails attached to these specific accounts. The digital footprint did not lead back to my mother's office. It led directly to my sister, Ashley. The golden child was not just a passive beneficiary of our parents' toxic favoritism. She was an active, calculating co-conspirator in my financial execution. She knew exactly whose social security number she was typing into those digital applications. 12 years ago, she stood beside our mother at my graduation, adjusting the flower on her dress while I was publicly humiliated, basking in the glow of being the beautiful, chosen daughter. Now, I realized that her flawless, curated lifestyle was entirely financed by my stolen identity. They did not just steal my name to survive, they stole it to sparkle. They levied a vanity tax on my credit score, siphoning my hard-earned stability to fund a lavish, magazine-worthy vineyard wedding. It was an extravagant illusion purchased exclusively with federal fraud. If I had possessed any lingering, microscopic sliver of familial loyalty, this discovery surgically removed it. This was no longer just about Kimberly's desperate corporate mismanagement. This was a coordinated syndicate of greed. Ashley had eagerly exploited the sister they had collectively discarded, happily trading my financial security for a designer gown and a tropical vacation. I did not feel sorrow, and I certainly did not feel betrayed. I felt the absolute, lethal calm of an auditor who has just uncovered the smoking gun. There would be no path to redemption for them. There would be no secret settlement, no tearful apologies, and no quiet family reconciliation. I instructed my attorney to compile every fraudulent transaction, every logged IP address, and every forged signature into a single, undeniable dossier. We were not going to send a warning. We were going to let them build their perfect, expensive house of cards. and then we were going to systematically remove the foundational pillar. The invitation to Ashley's exclusive vineyard wedding arrived on my desk exactly 1 month before the ceremony. It was printed on heavy, cream cardstock with gold foiled lettering. It was not a gesture of family reconciliation. It was an expensive piece of bait designed to lure me back into their carefully curated performance. They needed my physical presence. If I attended the celebration without causing a scene, my mother could later argue in a deposition that my attendance implied retroactive consent to the financial arrangements. I did not bring Tyler. I needed to walk into that country club, not as a woman hiding behind her partner, but as the sole proprietor of my own identity. The vineyard was a masterclass in superficial luxury. Valets parked European sports cars, while a string quartet played on a perfectly manicured lawn. Everything sparkled, and all of it was financed by my stolen Social Security number. I barely made it past the champagne reception before my mother intercepted me. Kimberly grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging into my sleeve, and steered me sharply away from the crowd into an empty bridal suite. Ashley was already inside, pacing the hardwood floor in her $15,000 custom gown. The golden child did not look radiant today. She looked cornered. My mother locked the door and immediately dropped her polished socialite facade. She pulled a densely worded legal document from her designer handbag and slapped it onto a mirrored vanity table. It was a retroactive consent affidavit, bundled with a strict non-disclosure agreement. "Sign it," my mother demanded, her voice vibrating with suppressed panic. "We will refinance the commercial debt. I will liquidate my private offshore trust and wire you $100,000 by Monday. Just sign the paper, Brianna, and we can all move past this administrative misunderstanding." I did not reach for the pen. I just looked at her. For my entire childhood, this woman had terrified me. She had seemed so large, so untouchable, dictating everyone's worth with a single, cruel microphone toast. But standing in that bridal suite, staring at her sweating, desperate face, the illusion completely evaporated. This is the reality of narcissistic financial manipulators. Their power is nothing more than a rented facade. My mother and sister carried themselves like elite royalty, but their entire social standing was leased with stolen debt. They possessed no intrinsic value. Stripped of the credit lines they had hijacked from me, their wallets were completely empty, and their egos were entirely bankrupt. They were not powerful matriarchs or lifestyle influencers. They were just desperate, fraudulent actors terrified of the closing curtain. "I am not signing an affidavit to legalize a federal felony," I said, my voice as level as a flat line. I opened my briefcase and placed a cease and desist letter, along with a notice of intent to sue drafted by my attorney, directly on top of her hush money contract. "Your offer is declined." "The audit is complete." Ashley let out a sharp, panicked sob, clutching the tulle of her stolen dress. My mother lunged forward to grab the litigation notices, her composure shattering into pure hysteria. But before her hand could touch the paper, the heavy oak door of the bridal suite swung open. Brandon stood in the doorway. The groom, the meticulous wealth manager who handled high-net-worth corporate portfolios for a living, and the man my mother had explicitly lied to on his strict prenuptial asset disclosures. He took one look at his weeping bride, my mother's trembling hands, and the unmistakable layout of legal affidavits and litigation notices scattered across the vanity. The financial professional in him recognized the exact architecture of a collapsing scheme. "What?" Brandon asked, his voice deathly quiet, "is going on here?" Handing Brandon the dossier required zero exposition. Justifying the paperwork is a tactic for those caught in a lie. I was merely the courier of raw financial data. I slid the notice of intent to sue and the itemized credit card exhibits across the vanity. He reviewed the documents with the silent, rapid comprehension of a seasoned wealth manager. He saw his bride's name irrevocably tied to the fraudulent accounts financing the very $15,000 dress she was wearing. He looked at Ashley. She offered no defense, only a trembling, pathetic silence. Brandon did not scream. He did not throw the papers. He executed a flawless liquidation of his own engagement. He turned on his heel, walked out of the bridal suite, and strode directly to the vineyard lawn where 200 guests were waiting. He didn't take the microphone to broadcast their crimes, protecting himself from any legal defamation risks. Instead, he coldly informed them they were permanently blacklisted from his wealth management networks, then instructed the wedding planner to vaguely announce to the crowd that due to insurmountable discrepancies, the wedding would not proceed. I did not stay to watch the fallout. I walked past the gasping guests, through the pristine vineyard, and got into my car. I left them to the federal authorities and the compounding interest of their own lies. Kimberly and Ashley would soon face federal indictments for wire fraud, while Richard would lose the agency he had allowed to rot. A week later, I sat on my balcony in Chicago, the cool evening breeze washing away the stagnant memory of my childhood. Tyler sat beside me, pouring 2 glasses of wine. I took the remaining copies of the fraudulent commercial loan documents, drew a thick black line through my forged signatures, and fed them into my cross-cut shredder. The mechanical grinding was the sound of a closed account. The ledger was finally zeroed out. To anyone listening who has ever been made to feel like the invisible, spare child in your own home, boundaries are not punishments. They are strict conditions for access to your life. Accountability is not cruelty just because the person facing it shares your bloodline. Love without respect is just a control tactic, and loyalty without truth is merely complicity. If protecting your family's image requires you to disappear, whose family are you really protecting? You do not have to destroy the people who mistreated you to reclaim your life. You simply have to stop financing their comfort with your dignity and stop treating access to your peace as a permanent family right. Have you ever had to walk away from a table where you were no longer respected to protect your own peace? Share your story in the comments below. Your survival might be the exact blueprint someone else needs today. And do not forget to subscribe if you stand for building a life of truth and justice.